In this gripping story about racism, a black CEO faces deep prejudice as he is unjustly targeted by racist police officers and community members who undermine his authority simply based on his appearance. Despite his wealth and success, he's treated with disdain and suspicion, forced to endure microaggressions and overt racism from those in power. As he fights to defend his integrity and implement vital community health initiatives, the systemic biases against him grow more blatant, escalating the tension and making viewers confront the uncomfortable realities of racism in America. The humid city air clung to Layla's skin as she stepped out of the sleek black car and onto the bustling sidewalk. The towering buildings around her reflected the bright afternoon sun, casting sharp shadows that sliced through the streets like 1,000 blades. Layla's heels clicked against the pavement as she walked with purpose, her head held high, the epitome of confidence and success. She was used to this world, the world of power lunches, high-end brands, and art galleries, a world where appearances mattered more than substance and where she thrived. She adjusted the perfectly tailored blazer that clung to her frame, ensuring that every inch of her appearance reflected the image she had worked so hard to craft. A quick glance at her watch confirmed that she was right on time for her meeting with the board of directors for the upcoming luxury real estate project she had just secured funding for. Layla was a woman who took pride in the control she held over every situation, every decision. Nothing ever seemed beyond her reach. As she neared the entrance of the upscale boutique hotel, she noticed a young man standing just outside, waiting patiently, his attire far too casual for the environment. He was dressed in an old faded denim jacket and sneakers, a stark contrast to the well-dressed crowd that populated the area. His posture was calm, but his presence was jarring. Layla couldn't help but sneer slightly, her sharp eyes quickly assessing him. He didn't belong here, not in this space, not in her world. With a dismissive glance, she turned her attention back to the door and strode inside, her every movement deliberate, her mind already shifting to the business ahead. As she approached the elevators, Layla noticed the receptionist speaking quietly with the young man. His presence had clearly made her uneasy. She smirked. Probably another lost tourist, she thought. He'll figure out that this isn't the place for him soon enough. Layla's confidence was unwavering as she entered the elevator, pressing the button for the penthouse suite. She had mastered this world, controlled it with ease, but the moment the elevator doors closed, something shifted. An odd feeling crept through her, something she couldn't quite place. She felt unsettled, as if an invisible force was tugging at her, but she dismissed it quickly. She would not allow herself to be distracted by something as trivial as a stranger's appearance. As she walked down the corridor toward the meeting room, Layla's phone buzzed in her hand. It was a message from her assistant. "The board is expecting you. Everything is set for the pitch." She read the message with a smile, the familiar sense of power returning to her. But as she approached the meeting room, her steps faltered for just a moment. There, standing at the head of the table, was the same young man from outside. His casual attire looked even more out of place now, surrounded by the polished, well-dressed members of the board. Layla's heart skipped a beat, her confidence slipping for the first time in a long while. What was he doing here? "Ah, Ms. Williams," a voice called from the table, pulling her from her thoughts. She turned to see the CEO of the firm, a longtime associate, giving her a warm, welcoming smile. "Please join us. We've been waiting for you to start the presentation." Layla's gaze flickered back to the young man. He was sitting at the table now, not standing, not making eye contact, but his presence seemed to dominate the room. A chill ran through her. "Is there a reason he's here?" Layla asked, her voice betraying none of the unease she felt, though the words came out more sharply than intended. Her associate, Mr. Lawrence, looked at her, his smile faltering for just a moment. "Oh, he's the new investor. Layla. The one who took over the board, Mr. Caleb Green." The morning light filtered through the open windows of the diner, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the sharp tang of sizzling bacon and eggs on the griddle. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's name, but there was no pretense. People came to get away from the pressures of life, to share a moment of peace over a hearty breakfast, or to gossip about the latest town drama. In this small town, it was easy to forget the weight that came with being someone. A woman sat alone at a corner booth, her silver tablet open in front of her, fingers lightly tapping the screen as she reviewed documents for the meeting ahead. Dr. Olivia Clark, a respected surgeon, had built her career with a reputation for precision, humility, and a fierce drive to help those who had no voice. The town knew her as a brilliant mind, someone who had turned the local clinic into a state-of-the-art facility while providing free care to those who couldn't afford it. Despite her wealth and accomplishments, Olivia didn't walk around in tailored suits or designer heels. She wore simple, well-worn clothes, a comfortable blue blouse, and jeans that were a size too big, purchased on sale from a local department store. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and a subtle gold necklace was her only nod to the kind of luxury people assumed she could afford. The diner wasn't the kind of place Olivia frequented often. She was more likely to be found in the clinic or giving a lecture at the medical school in the next town over. But today, she wanted something different. A little peace before the storm of the day. A storm that would involve meeting with the town council to discuss a controversial proposal that would improve healthcare access, but would also challenge the deeply entrenched systems of privilege and politics in the community. She had been fighting this battle for years now, trying to bridge the gap between the underserved communities she cared about and the wealthy, indifferent town officials who seemed more concerned with their bottom lines than the people who lived and worked here. But Olivia wasn't deterred. She knew how to navigate those spaces, how to make them listen when they were too caught up in their own privilege to see the bigger picture. Her colleagues called her a trailblazer. But that didn't mean she didn't feel the weight of it all, the skepticism, the prejudices that lingered behind polite smiles and gestures of support. Every meeting, every conversation, felt like a quiet battle. It wasn't just about the initiatives she championed, it was about the way she was treated simply for being who she was. A black woman with a powerful voice in a world that expected her to be silent. As she took a sip from the coffee cup in front of her, Olivia glanced up at the door of the diner. The bell jingled softly as a man entered. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a light brown leather jacket that looked a little too new for the small-town setting. His dark hair was neatly combed, and there was something about his presence, something that made him stand out even before he walked further into the diner. Olivia didn't know him, but there was something strangely familiar about him. She watched as he made his way to the counter and exchanged a few words with the hostess, who seemed to hesitate for a moment, but then pointed him toward an empty table in the far corner. Olivia's eyes narrowed slightly. The man didn't belong here, not in this diner, and certainly not in this town. It wasn't a conscious judgment, but there was something in the way he moved, something in his confident yet casual demeanor that immediately set him apart from the rest of the diners, who, for the most part, were locals. Olivia had seen it before, the way people who weren't from around here were treated. Sometimes it was subtle, a shift in tone or the slight pause before someone offered a greeting. Other times, it was more overt, dismissive stares, whispered comments. She turned her attention back to her tablet, but her mind wandered back to the man as she continued to sip her coffee. Her hand paused on the edge of her mug. There was a strange discomfort in the pit of her stomach. It wasn't the man himself, but the quiet, unspoken assumptions that seemed to hang in the air. The assumptions about who belonged and who didn't, about who deserved to be in spaces like this, and who was expected to leave as soon as their mistake was noticed. Olivia had been the subject of those assumptions her entire life. From her time growing up in a neighborhood that few in town would even acknowledge to her rise in the medical field, she had spent her career proving to others, and to herself, that she belonged in these spaces. But despite her success, despite the respect she had earned, she was still subjected to the same quiet bias that defined much of this town. The door chimed again, and Olivia's attention was pulled back to the present. A woman entered, dressed in the kind of suit that screamed, money, perfectly tailored, perfectly pressed. Her platinum blonde hair was styled to perfection, and her heels clicked against the floor with an authoritative confidence that suggested she owned the place. As she passed the man at the table, she hesitated, her eyes scanning him with the same judgment Olivia had seen so many times before. A brief flicker of confusion crossed her face before she moved on, taking a seat at the counter without even acknowledging the man's presence. Olivia's eyes narrowed slightly. The woman's behavior wasn't surprising. She had seen it time and time again. People who carried their privilege like armor, assuming that anyone outside their world was somehow less deserving of the space they occupied. It wasn't just racism, it was classism, elitism, and the deep-seated belief that those who weren't born into wealth didn't belong. As the man at the table quietly sipped his water, Olivia's mind drifted back to her own work. She had dedicated herself to dismantling these kinds of systems that excluded and marginalized, systems that made people like her feel as though they had to fight twice as hard to earn the same respect. The injustice was suffocating, and Olivia had spent years pushing against it. But there were moments when even she felt the weight of it all. The quiet moments when the assumptions were not spoken, but felt. The waitress came over to the man's table, her smile a little too bright, too forced. Olivia caught the briefest moment of hesitation before the waitress spoke. The words were too soft for Olivia to hear clearly, but it didn't take long to see the change in the man's expression. His posture shifted, and Olivia watched as the waitress turned away, her shoulders slightly hunched as though she had just been caught doing something wrong. Olivia raised an eyebrow. She could see it now. The discomfort, the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The man's presence was unsettling everyone around him, even though he hadn't said a word. That was the power of being black in a place like this, a power that didn't come from wealth or influence, but from the simple fact of existing in spaces where you weren't wanted. She watched as the man continued to sit calmly, waiting for whatever was coming next. He didn't look upset. In fact, he seemed entirely unbothered, though there was a quiet strength in the way he held himself. Olivia found herself intrigued. There was something about him, something that made her want to know more. But the reality of the situation set in quickly. People like him didn't belong in places like this, or so they were made to feel. Olivia's hand tightened around her coffee mug, her fingers pressing against the ceramic, the heat of it seeping into her palm. She had been fighting this kind of bias for years, and yet, every day, it seemed to persist. People could pretend they didn't see it, but it was there, lurking just beneath the surface, poisoning interactions and shaping lives. The bell above the door chimed once again, and this time, the noise was louder than before. Olivia's mind snapped back to the present as a group of local men walked in. Their laughter filled the space, their voices carrying far too loudly for such a small place. They seemed to know everyone in the diner, exchanging friendly greetings with the regulars. But as they passed the man at the table, their conversation faltered. One of them shot a glance toward the man, and then, as if on cue, they all made a point of ignoring him, not even sparing a second glance. Olivia could feel the tension building. She took another sip of her coffee, her eyes scanning the room as the man continued to sit there. His presence was a disruption. Not just because of who he was, but because of the way people responded to him. The subtle dismissals, the glances that spoke volumes more than words ever could. She shifted in her seat, glancing once more at the man. There was something about him, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. But as the morning stretched on, Olivia realized she was no longer thinking about the clinic or the upcoming town hall. She was thinking about him, and the quiet battle he was fighting, whether he realized it or not, was a battle she understood all too well. The bell over the diner door chimed once again, a little too sharply, pulling Olivia's focus away from her coffee. She glanced up, catching the silhouette of the man from the corner of her eye. He hadn't moved from his seat, his posture as composed as ever, but Olivia could sense something was shifting. There was a subtle unease in the air, an undercurrent of discomfort that she recognized all too well. The group of local men who had entered earlier was still making their rounds, chatting with the regulars at the counter and slipping into booths with casual familiarity. But this time, one of them, an older man with a thick gray beard and a baseball cap, lingered by the entrance, eyeing the man at the far corner. Olivia could see the flicker of hesitation in the man's gaze. It was brief, but it was enough. He wasn't just looking at another diner. He was sizing up the stranger, assessing him, deciding whether he belonged in the same space. "Hey, Benny," one of the men called from the counter. "You gonna sit down, or are you just gonna stand there looking like you're about to start a fight?" Benny didn't answer immediately. His eyes were still trained on the man at the corner table. Olivia could feel the weight of his scrutiny from across the room. "He's just sitting there, isn't he?" Benny muttered, his tone carrying an edge that Olivia couldn't ignore. Olivia's hand tightened around her coffee mug. She knew what was coming. It was always the same in places like this. The way the townspeople assumed that someone who didn't look like them was out of place, even when the reality was far more complicated. The unspoken rules of who belonged and who didn't. She saw Benny exchange a glance with another man in the group, someone younger, with a clean-shaven face and a button-down shirt. The younger man made a subtle but noticeable nod toward the stranger, and Olivia's heart sank. It was the kind of subtle cue that people used when they didn't want to overtly make a scene, but they wanted the message clear nonetheless. "Guess he must be lost," Benny continued, louder now, as he walked toward the man's table, his heavy boots clanking against the floor. "This is a private place. You got money for this kind of meal?" Olivia's breath caught in her throat. She had seen it before. The quiet degradation, the assumption that someone who didn't look the part could never be part of the world that was so readily accepted by the town's upper crust. It was a different kind of violence, quiet, insidious, and meant to remind everyone who was truly in control. The man didn't flinch, didn't raise an eyebrow. His calmness was almost unsettling. Olivia admired it in some ways, how he seemed to float above it all, but she knew better. She knew that silence in the face of such aggression was a powerful response, but it didn't make it easier to bear. "Sir," the younger man said, now addressing the stranger with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Can I help you with something?" The man looked up, finally meeting their gaze. His eyes, calm and unwavering, studied the group for a moment before he spoke. "I'm fine, thank you," he said, his voice low and steady. Benny's grin widened. It was a smirk, one that seemed to carry all the weight of 1,000 years of silent privilege. "You sure maybe you're just in the wrong place, huh?" For a moment, Olivia thought the man would stand up, his quiet dignity suddenly faltering under the pressure. She could see the subtle clench of his jaw, the small tension in his shoulders. But then, something shifted. His hand stayed relaxed on the edge of the table, his gaze unfaltering. "I'm sure," the man replied again, his voice as composed as ever. "But I appreciate your concern." The air in the diner had thickened, and Olivia could feel the growing discomfort from the regulars, most of them pretending not to watch, but all too aware of what was happening. The scene was playing out in slow motion, a reminder of the invisible lines that divided them all, the haves and the have-nots, the ones who were supposed to be there, and the ones who weren't. Benny opened his mouth to speak again, but the words didn't come. Olivia could tell he was calculating the situation. Perhaps he realized the man wasn't about to back down, and that unsettled him. Or perhaps it was something else entirely. A moment of recognition that maybe he had misjudged the situation, that the man at the table might have been more than he had first assumed. But before Benny could make another move, the waitress arrived, cutting the tension like a knife. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her voice polite, but Olivia could tell there was something different in her demeanor. The woman stood taller now, her shoulders straighter, her gaze avoiding Benny's for just a moment. Benny's smile faltered, and for a brief second, Olivia could see the shift, the moment when someone realized that their behavior had been noticed, had been scrutinized by someone with more power than they had expected. "Everything's fine, Janet," Benny said, his voice suddenly tight. "Just trying to make sure we're all on the same page here." The waitress nodded, but didn't back away. Instead, she shot a quick glance at the man. "Of course, sir. We'll make sure everything's taken care of," she said. Olivia watched, her chest tight, as the waitress moved away. The man at the table remained seated, calm as ever. His expression was unreadable, but his presence was unmistakable. He had stood his ground without saying a word, and in a way, that had been enough. Benny's bravado had slipped, the power dynamic had shifted, and there was nothing left for him to do but walk away. Olivia's mind raced as she observed the scene. She knew it wasn't over. This wasn't a simple case of one man standing up to another. It was about something much bigger, a system that defined who was worthy of respect, of space, of attention, and who was not. A system that didn't see people like this man, who had clearly earned his place, as someone who should be treated with the same courtesy as anyone else. Olivia's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee again. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This quiet battle, fought in a diner on a lazy Tuesday morning, was just another reminder of how hard she had to work to make sure she was seen. Not just as a successful surgeon, not just as a woman who had built a reputation on skill and hard work, but as a human being who deserved the same treatment as anyone else. The tension in the diner was palpable, but it was a tension that had long ago become part of Olivia's everyday life. The microaggressions, the double takes, the subtle dismissals, they were all familiar to her, and yet they never lost their sting. No matter how much success she had under her belt, no matter how many accolades she had earned, there was always someone who would look at her and wonder why she was there. She caught the man's eye again, but this time, she didn't look away. She didn't have to. There was a recognition between them now, an understanding of the invisible battles they were both fighting, in their own ways, just by existing in a world that didn't always want them to be seen. For a moment, Olivia wondered if he had experienced the same kind of discomfort she had, the quiet racism, the subtle judgment from people who believed they had the right to decide who deserved to be in this space. But she didn't ask. She didn't need to. Their silent acknowledgement was enough. The hum of quiet conversation and the clink of silverware that had once seemed so soothing to Olivia now felt like a drumbeat of anxiety, pounding in her ears. The tension in the diner had grown to a fever pitch, the unease almost palpable. She could feel every glance, every whispered word that tried to diminish her presence. Benny had returned to his seat, but the ripple effect of his disrespect lingered in the air, thick with unspoken challenges and judgment. The man in the corner had managed to diffuse the situation for now, but Olivia knew better than to think the matter was settled. It was simmering, waiting for the right moment to boil over. Her heart raced as the waitress came back, this time with a new edge to her movements. Olivia watched her approach with purpose, her eyes flicking to the man across the room, Samuel Holt. Something about the waitress's demeanor had shifted too. She was walking with a quiet urgency now, no longer uncertain or hesitant. When she passed Olivia's table, their eyes briefly met, and Olivia could see the reflection of a shared understanding. The waitress knew what was coming. She knew it too, and that, more than anything, made the air feel suffocating. "Everything all right over here?" the waitress asked, forcing a smile in Olivia's direction. The words, though polite, were flat. The sincerity, absent. Olivia nodded, though her stomach churned. "Yes, thank you," she managed, keeping her voice steady. It wasn't much, but it was all she could offer. She could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on her. She had spent years honing her ability to navigate the rooms that looked down on her, to remain unshaken in the face of overt or subtle racism. But here, in this moment, with the simmering tensions around her, it felt different. This wasn't about quiet dismissals. This was an open confrontation of power, her power, or lack thereof in their eyes. As the waitress moved away, Olivia's eyes flickered back to Samuel Holt. He was still seated at the far corner of the diner, looking every bit the picture of calm in the midst of the storm. But Olivia knew the storm hadn't passed, it was coming. And when it arrived, she needed to be ready. The door chime rang again, and Olivia's heart skipped as two uniformed officers entered the diner. Officer Daniels, his face a mask of unyielding authority, walked in first, followed by Officer Ramirez. They exchanged a few quiet words, but it was clear they had come for a reason. A subtle shift in the air, the same kind of shift that preceded every major conflict Olivia had ever faced. Something was about to break. She could feel it deep in her bones. Benny's posture immediately straightened. He exchanged a quick glance with the officers before nodding in their direction. The message was clear. Olivia's stomach twisted. As they made their way across the room, Olivia could see the way their eyes flicked toward Samuel, almost as though the sight of him wasn't just a nuisance, it was a problem. She could feel the weight of the moment building. It wasn't just that Samuel was a black man in this space, it was that he wasn't supposed to be here. Not in their eyes. "Excuse me, Mr. Holt," Officer Daniels said, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to commanding respect. "We've had a complaint." Olivia's pulse quickened. She tried to keep her breathing steady as the officers continued their approach. Samuel stood up slowly, the calmness in his movements betraying a deep well of experience. He didn't seem startled by the officer's presence, and if anything, his response was measured and deliberate. "A complaint?" he asked, his voice level, neither confrontational nor deferential. "Yeah," Officer Ramirez added, his tone a little less firm but still tinged with something Olivia couldn't quite place. "Disdain, maybe? We've been asked to check on a situation. Some of the locals don't feel comfortable with your presence here." The words hit Olivia like a slap. They weren't subtle, weren't veiled. It was a direct attempt to undermine Samuel's presence, to strip him of his humanity in the eyes of everyone in the room. She could see it now. The familiar systemic bias that had followed her for years, lurking in every interaction, in every subtle glance. It had come for Samuel too. Samuel didn't flinch, didn't shift. His shoulders were squared, his face impassive, but Olivia could see the tightness in his jaw. He was managing himself, but the strain was visible. He didn't want to cause a scene, didn't want to escalate it further. He didn't have to. The situation was already a powder keg, and it only needed a single spark to set it off. He paused for a moment, his gaze steady on Officer Daniels. "So, what exactly are you saying?" he asked, his tone quiet, but carrying the weight of someone who had seen this kind of thing before. Officer Daniels hesitated for a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. But it was brief, quickly masked by the controlled authority that had defined his career. "I'm saying we have to ask you to leave," he said, the words coming out almost too easily, like a reflex he had learned long ago. "There's been a complaint you're disturbing the peace here." The room seemed to fall into a collective silence. The regulars around the diner shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting nervously between the officers, and Samuel Olivia could hear her heart pounding in her ears. This wasn't just about a man sitting at a table. This was about power, the kind of power that could shut a person down in an instant, not because they were guilty, but because the system had decided they didn't belong. Samuel didn't move, he didn't react. He simply stood there, his hands folded in front of him. And for the first time, Olivia saw it clearly. The calm confidence that had carried him to this point, the quiet strength that refused to be shaken, no matter what was thrown at him. "I'm not leaving," Samuel said, his voice low but firm. Officer Ramirez glanced at Daniels, a subtle flicker of hesitation in his gaze. It was clear he wasn't entirely comfortable with this, but he didn't speak. Officer Daniels, on the other hand, seemed resolute. "Listen, Mr. Holt," he said, his tone lowering to something almost threatening. "You're not above the law. We've been asked to remove you. Now you can make this easy, or we can make this hard." The threat was obvious, but Samuel didn't flinch. He simply met their gaze, calm as ever. He wasn't backing down, not now. Not after everything he had fought for. "I've done nothing wrong," he said, his words carrying a weight that made everyone in the room pause. "I'll leave when I choose to leave, not before." For a moment, Olivia thought the room might implode. The tension was thick, suffocating. The eyes of the regulars were upon them now, some of them eager for a confrontation, others afraid of what might happen next. But Olivia could sense the shift. The energy had turned. Samuel wasn't just refusing to back down, he was calling their bluff, exposing the systemic nature of their bias in front of everyone. The officers stood there, eyes locked with Samuel, the standoff hanging in the air like an unspoken battle. Then, something changed. A voice broke through the silence. "Is there a problem here?" The voice came from behind the officers, and Olivia's heart leaped in her chest. Mitchell, her old colleague, a local physician who had become an ally in the fight for equality in the community, was standing near the entrance. He had just entered the diner, and as soon as he saw the scene unfolding, he had stepped forward, his face serious. Mitchell had always been one of the few people Olivia could trust to see things as they were, without the lenses of bias clouding his vision. His presence now was a lifeline. The officers shifted, looking back at Mitchell with a mix of surprise and unease. They had not expected someone like Mitchell to intervene, not in the way he had. Mitchell wasn't an outsider. He was a well-known figure in the town, a doctor, highly respected. His words carried weight. "Dr. Mitchell," Officer Daniels said, his voice suddenly a little less certain. "There's no need for you to get involved. This is a matter of protocol." Mitchell's gaze flicked to Samuel, who still stood firm, his stance unwavering. Then he turned back to the officers. "I'm afraid it's not. Not when you're trying to remove a paying customer based on nothing more than a complaint with no merit. I suggest you leave him be." The officers exchanged an uncomfortable glance. Olivia could see the subtle crack in their armor. They hadn't expected anyone to step up in this way. The power dynamic had shifted, but as the officers began to retreat, Olivia's mind raced. She knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. This was just the beginning of something bigger. A reckoning that would shake the town to its core. And as Samuel turned toward Mitchell, a slight nod of acknowledgement, she knew the next phase was about to begin. This wouldn't be a quiet battle. It would be the kind of stand that would change everything. The tension in the diner was palpable, so thick that even the usual hum of voices seemed muffled. Olivia's pulse was quickening as the officers slowly retreated, their footsteps heavy as they moved back toward the door. But even as Mitchell stood with his firm, unwavering presence, Olivia could feel something shifting. She knew this wasn't just about a spat over an uncomfortable situation. This was a battle. It was one that she and Samuel would need to face together. But they weren't ready for what was coming. "Is everything all right, Olivia?" Mitchell's voice, though quiet, carried across the room. His question was gentle, but there was a weight behind it. Mitchell had known Olivia long enough to sense when things had shifted, when her usual calm had given way to something more dangerous. Olivia blinked, her thoughts still racing. "I'm fine, it's just starting." Samuel's sharp eyes caught hers for a moment, and the silent communication between them was almost electric. He knew what was coming too. This wasn't just some passing moment of discomfort, this was deeper. It was about power, his, hers, and the forces that constantly tried to strip both of them of it. The officers had backed off for now, but Olivia could sense that something was about to escalate. Officer Daniels was muttering something to Officer Ramirez, but his words were low enough that only a few of the nearby patrons could hear. "Let's go," Daniels said, his voice gruff and filled with an anger that was barely contained. "This is not the time or the place." But as they started toward the door, Mitchell took a step forward, the weight of his years of practice as a physician and an ally, giving him an unshakable confidence in moments like these. He had seen Olivia in situations where she was fighting the system, standing her ground for what was right. But this was different. Mitchell could see the crack in her usual composed exterior. "I don't think this is over yet, officer," Mitchell said, his voice cool but laced with an unmistakable authority that made Officer Daniels pause. "You've made your point already, haven't you?" Olivia watched the officers tense up. Officer Ramirez exchanged an uneasy glance with Daniels, who then turned to face Mitchell, his hands instinctively going to his belt. "What do you mean?" Officer Daniels barked. "I mean," Mitchell continued, his gaze never wavering, "you've made your point that a black man doesn't belong in this space, but you need to understand something. Your actions here aren't just about making a scene, they're about more than that. They're about showing everyone in this room that you have the power to dictate who belongs and who doesn't, and frankly, that's something we need to talk about." The silence stretched, thick with the weight of Mitchell's words. The room, which had been quietly watching the exchange, seemed to hold its breath. The soft clink of silverware was replaced by the uncomfortable shuffle of people adjusting in their seats. Olivia could feel their eyes on her, and she wondered what they were thinking. They knew she was a woman of influence, but the power struggle here was something deeper. Daniels clenched his jaw, frustration seeping through his features. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mitchell," he spat out, his voice rising. "This man is causing a scene in a place he has no business being." His voice rang out harshly in the diner, and Olivia could see a few of the patrons flinch, though none dared to speak. Mitchell took a deep breath, stepping closer to Samuel, positioning himself as a silent protector. He'd known Samuel long enough to see the way he had been slighted by this very system. Both of them had been, but it was clear now that Samuel would not back down. Mitchell wasn't sure if he would. "I know exactly what I'm talking about, officer. You've seen it. I've seen it. And I think you know what this is really about. This isn't just about Samuel Holt's presence. This is about you, Officer Daniels, telling everyone that the power you have in this town is enough to dictate who's allowed to be here and who isn't," Mitchell said, his words deliberate. There was a brief flicker of hesitation in Officer Daniels' eyes, something that showed for a split second that he wasn't sure how to proceed, but it was gone before anyone could fully grasp it. The tension still hung heavy in the air. "I think it's time we let Samuel decide how to handle this," Mitchell finished, turning slightly toward Samuel, his eyes quietly asking for permission. Samuel, who had been standing there the entire time, unwavering, took a slow step forward, his composure a silent testament to everything he had fought for. Every step felt like it carried weight. Every second of silence before he spoke seemed to stretch out forever, but when Samuel did speak, his voice was steady, clear, and unyielding. "Look, I'm not here to make trouble," Samuel began, his gaze never leaving the officers. "I'm not here to challenge anyone, but I've been challenged enough by this system. It doesn't matter who I am, it doesn't matter that I own this diner now. All that matters is how you treat people, how you treat me, because if I'm not safe here, then what does that say about this place? What does that say about this town?" Samuel's voice didn't rise in anger, nor did it waver in fear. It held a quiet power, the kind that comes from years of being underestimated, of facing the relentless push of systemic oppression without ever allowing it to bend him. There was a long pause before Daniels finally spoke again, his voice dripping with the bitterness of a man caught between authority and discomfort. "You think your money and your title give you the right to come in here and—" "I think the people in this room," Samuel interrupted, his eyes now sweeping over the gathered patrons, "deserve to see what it looks like when someone is treated with respect. It's not about me, it's about all of us. We're here, we're speaking. And no matter what you think, I belong. So does Olivia. So do all of you." His voice rang out clear and unwavering, silencing the din of whispers that had filled the space. The officers were momentarily speechless, caught off guard by the sheer audacity of his words. And in that brief moment, Olivia could feel her resolve strengthening. The injustice, which had simmered in her chest for so long, was finally bubbling to the surface. This wasn't just about Samuel anymore, it was about the entire system of oppression that they had both been fighting. Samuel was using his position to take a stand, not for his own gain, but to shift the power dynamics of an entire town. Mitchell glanced at Olivia, his expression a mixture of admiration and caution. "Olivia, this is where we make our move," he whispered. Though he knew it wasn't just about making a move, it was about dismantling something much bigger. And then it happened. Before Olivia could even respond, Officer Ramirez stepped forward, an ominous glint in his eyes. "Maybe it's time we put this to an official test," he said, his tone deliberately challenging. "We've had enough trouble with this one." He motioned to Samuel with a sharp, accusatory gesture. The officers were closing in, their movements now swift and deliberate. Olivia's breath caught in her throat as her pulse quickened. She knew exactly what this was, the beginning of a confrontation that would cost them all far more than they realized. Samuel didn't move, but Olivia could see the slightest shift in his posture. He was bracing himself now, not for the conflict, but for what came next. It was a moment that had the potential to shatter everything they had fought for. Olivia reached out to him, her voice low but insistent. "Don't do this. We don't need to make it worse, we can walk away." Samuel met her gaze, his expression unreadable, but his eyes filled with resolve. He was about to take a stand, no matter the consequences. This wasn't about walking away anymore. It was about being seen, about fighting for their right to exist in this space without apology. "I've been walking away my whole life," Samuel said quietly. "It's time to stand up." The officers moved toward him, their hands tightening on their batons, and then, the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what was coming next. The diner, which had once felt like a neutral ground, now hummed with an unspoken tension. Every step Samuel Holt took felt like it was shaking the foundation of everything they had all built up. Every assumption, every piece of societal armor that had long protected the system. Olivia's chest tightened as she stood by his side, watching the officers close in, the thick, oppressive air between them now palpable. Officer Daniels, the enforcer of the old ways, took another step forward, his eyes narrowing with disdain. "You really want to make this a spectacle, Mr. Holt?" Daniels sneered, his voice low but cutting. He wasn't asking for permission, and he certainly wasn't interested in diplomacy. Olivia could feel the unspoken power dynamics at play. Daniels thought he had the upper hand. Samuel didn't flinch. His face remained a mask of calm, but Olivia knew him well enough to see the quiet intensity simmering beneath the surface. He wasn't going to back down. She could feel the weight of the moment. His decision had already been made. Spectacle? Samuel's voice was measured, but it held a steel edge. He glanced around the diner, meeting the eyes of the few remaining patrons, his gaze unwavering. The spectacle was created when you decided to make assumptions about who belongs here. The spectacle will continue if you don't back off. Daniel's lips twitched into a derisive smile, clearly savoring the moment. What do you think you're doing here? Playing the hero? You don't belong in this world. You think your money and your title will make people forget where you really come from. The words hung in the air, poisoned and cold. Olivia felt a surge of anger rise within her chest. This wasn't about Samuel's money. It was never about that. This was about the power dynamics, about the way he was being reduced to nothing more than a stereotype. Just another black man, being forced to face the prejudices that permeated every inch of this town. Mitchell stepped forward slightly, his posture straightening. "Daniels, I think you've overstepped," he said, his voice tinged with authority. But Samuel held up a hand, signaling to Mitchell to stand down. "Don't," Samuel said quietly, his eyes never leaving Daniels. "Let him speak. This is exactly what we're here to confront, the system that thinks it has the right to decide who belongs and who doesn't." The quiet challenge in Samuel's voice made Daniel's face redden. "You think you've got it all figured out, don't you? You come in here and think you're going to change everything? You're just another black man trying to disrupt the order." Olivia's stomach churned at the weight of Daniel's words. The underlying venom in his statement wasn't new. She had encountered it many times before in different forms. But it never stopped hurting. It never stopped feeling like a slap in the face. For a moment, she wanted to shout, to lash out. But Samuel's quiet, unwavering presence calmed her. He wasn't about to give this officer any satisfaction. "I'm not here to change anything but the way people like you see the world," Samuel said, his tone almost too calm, as though he were discussing a simple matter of fact. "You're not the authority in this room, I am. So if you want to make a scene, I suggest you leave before it gets worse." Daniels froze, his eyes widening for a fraction of a second before they narrowed again in pure defiance. "You think I'm going to just walk away from this? You're delusional." Olivia could feel her pulse quicken as the scene reached its breaking point. She wanted to intervene, but something in Samuel's unshakable composure told her that now was the time for him to take the reins. "You're right," Samuel continued, taking a small step toward Daniels, never breaking eye contact. "You're not going to walk away, but you'll understand that I'm not going anywhere, and neither is anyone else. You've underestimated people like me. We've been standing here the whole time, waiting for moments like this to come. We're not leaving. You are." Olivia watched in stunned silence as Daniel seemed to hesitate for a moment. The crowd was silent now, a heavy silence that hung between them like the calm before a storm. And then, Daniels made the mistake of underestimating Samuel again. "You really think you're untouchable, huh?" Daniels sneered. "Just because you've got money and connections, you think you can run this town?" Before Samuel could respond, Daniels lunged forward, his hand reaching out to grab Samuel's shoulder. It was swift, a motion meant to intimidate, but Samuel's reflexes were faster. In an instant, he shifted his weight, ducking slightly and twisting away from Daniels's grip. The tension in the diner seemed to snap like a taut wire. Daniels, momentarily stunned by the ease with which Samuel had evaded his grasp, took a step back, his hand instinctively reaching for his baton. But just as quickly, Samuel turned to face him, blocking the officer's movement with a single step forward. "Don't," Samuel warned, his voice low but firm. "You don't want to take this any further. You don't know who you're dealing with." Olivia's heart was racing in her chest as she watched the standoff unfold. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath, the weight of Samuel's calm authority pressing down on everyone. And then, something unexpected happened. Daniels looked over his shoulder at Officer Ramirez, who had been silent until now, watching the situation unfold with a quiet discomfort in his eyes. Ramirez exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible glance with Daniels, and in that moment, something shifted. All right," Daniels grunted, his hand slowly falling away from his baton. "But you've crossed the line, Holt. This is far from over." Olivia felt a strange sense of relief wash over her as Daniels stepped back, his face still twisted in anger but not moving forward. Samuel hadn't just stood his ground. He had taken control of the situation in a way that left Daniels powerless. And in that moment, Olivia realized that Samuel wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every person who had been silenced by people like Daniels for far too long. The officers slowly backed toward the door, but before they left, Samuel spoke once more. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer," he said, his voice steady, with no hint of fear or retreat. "But know this, next time you decide to make assumptions about someone, make sure you know who you're dealing with." Daniel's jaw clenched as he turned to leave, dragging Ramirez behind him. The door swung shut behind them with a soft, final chime. The room was silent for a moment longer, and then, as if in disbelief, the patrons began to murmur, their quiet conversations returning to life. But the shift in the atmosphere was unmistakable. The balance of power had changed. Olivia turned to Samuel, who was standing tall, his expression calm, but still full of purpose. It was clear that Samuel had just taken a stand, not just against the officers, but against an entire system that had been set up to oppress people like him. And it was something he wasn't willing to let slide. "Thank you," Olivia whispered, her voice tight with emotion. She wasn't sure what else to say, but the gratitude was there, clear in her eyes. Samuel nodded, offering a small, resolute smile. "This isn't over," he said, as though speaking to both Olivia and the room at large. "But this is how we fight back, one stand at a time." The words hit Olivia like a punch to the gut, and she realized then that Samuel wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for something much bigger, something that could change the very fabric of this town. But as the door to the diner closed behind the officers, leaving an uncomfortable silence in their wake, Olivia felt a shift in herself as well. She had been a bystander for too long. Now, it was her turn to make a stand. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the din of the diner slowly returned, the weight of Samuel's words hung heavily in the air. They had won this battle, but the war was just beginning. The air in the diner had shifted from light banter and idle chatter to something thick and charged. Samuel Holt could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, though he never allowed himself to be swayed by the scrutiny. He had stood in similar rooms before, surrounded by whispers and judgment, and he had learned how to navigate them, how to hold his ground when the world seemed intent on knocking him down. Today, in this diner, however, the stakes were higher. The tension between Officer Daniels and Samuel was palpable, and the small group of bystanders, including Olivia, watched from the periphery. Samuel's calmness only seemed to fuel Daniels's simmering rage. He had come into the diner that afternoon thinking he could shake things up, believe he could exert his power, and dismiss Samuel with a few snide remarks. But Samuel wasn't a man who could be intimidated by a badge or by a history of injustice. "You don't belong here, Holt," Daniels snarled, his words laced with venom. The officer's hand rested on the baton at his side, a subtle reminder of the power he believed he held. "Just because you've got a couple of dollars in your pocket doesn't mean you get to disrespect people like this." Samuel didn't flinch. He kept his gaze steady, unwavering. "And just because you've got a badge doesn't mean you can look down on others. Daniels, not anymore." Daniels took a step forward, his hand tightening around the baton. "What did you say?" "I said," Samuel repeated, his voice louder now, his words cutting through the oppressive tension. "Just because you wear a uniform doesn't mean you have the right to walk all over people who don't fit your mold. You want to treat me like I don't belong here? You're about to find out who's in charge now." Olivia, who had been quiet up until this point, felt a shiver run down her spine. There was a force in Samuel's words, an authority he had earned through years of proving himself, not just in the boardrooms, but in every confrontation like this one. She knew this moment wasn't just for Samuel. It was for everyone who had been overlooked, dismissed, and belittled because of their skin color, their background, or their wealth. Daniel's face was flushed with anger, but Samuel's composure was like a wall against which Daniels could do nothing. "You think you can just walk in here and lecture me?" Daniels growled. "You think you've got some kind of power, but let me tell you something, Holt. You're still just a black man to me, that's all you'll ever be." Olivia sucked in a breath, the realization of just how deep Daniels's hatred ran, sending a chill down her spine. She glanced around, hoping someone would step in, but the room was eerily silent, the only sound the clinking of silverware and the soft murmurs of people pretending not to pay attention. Samuel's jaw tightened at Daniel's words, but there was no reaction beyond that. He wasn't giving the officer the satisfaction of a response filled with anger or violence. Instead, he took a step back, his posture shifting to something more deliberate, more controlled. "You're right," Samuel said, his voice low and steady. "I'm a black man, and that doesn't mean I owe you an apology or an explanation for who I am. But the fact that you can't see me as anything more than that?" He shook his head. "That's your problem, Daniels, not mine." The officer's nostrils flared. "So you think you can talk to me like that? You think your money and your title mean something in here?" "I don't need to talk down to you to prove anything," Samuel replied calmly. "And I'm not interested in discussing money or titles with someone who doesn't understand what those things really mean. What matters, Daniels, is who you are when no one is looking, and it's clear to me, you're not someone who knows how to treat people with respect." The atmosphere in the diner was suffocating. The patrons had become passive observers, watching the battle unfold between Samuel and Officer Daniels. Olivia could sense the weight of every word Samuel spoke, and she couldn't help but feel a knot tighten in her chest as the confrontation grew more intense. Daniels, unable to hide his anger any longer, stepped forward quickly, his hand reaching for his baton. Olivia's heart jumped in her throat. She knew that Samuel could hold his own, but the risk was undeniable. If things escalated, there would be no turning back. The whole situation could spiral into something far uglier than anyone was prepared for. But just as Daniels took a swing toward Samuel, something in Samuel's demeanor shifted. His body language, the set of his jaw. Without a word, he moved, sidestepping Daniels with a swift and fluid motion that left the officer stumbling. "Enough," Samuel said, his voice cold but commanding. "You're not going to intimidate me, and you're not going to make this about me either. This is about the kind of person you are, and it's ugly." For a moment, everything stood still. Daniels, momentarily stunned by Samuel's speed, stood there, his baton still raised. The anger in his eyes was palpable, but there was a flicker of doubt, a crack in his armor. "Get out of my way," Daniels spat, but the words didn't hold the weight they had earlier. Samuel's presence, his quiet authority, had shaken something deep within him, and deep down, even Daniels knew it. Before the situation could spiral further, Samuel took another step back, standing tall and unwavering. "If you think this is over, you're wrong. But you're not going to get away with this. I'm not going to let you intimidate me into silence or submission. Not today." Daniels hesitated, his eyes darting between Samuel and the people around them. Samuel had won this round, and Daniels could feel the weight of the realization crashing down on him. The officer slowly lowered his baton, his hand shaking with frustration. "This isn't over, Holt," he muttered under his breath before he turned and stormed out of the diner, followed by Officer Ramirez, who gave Samuel a quiet, reluctant glance. As the door swung shut behind them, the silence that followed was almost deafening. Olivia, who had been watching with bated breath, exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging in relief. Samuel, meanwhile, stood still for a moment longer, taking in the victory. But it wasn't a triumphant moment for him. Not exactly. It was a moment of survival, a moment where his dignity had been preserved. The room, once filled with hushed tension, began to buzz again. But now, there was something different in the air. People weren't just talking about what had happened, they were thinking about it. Olivia walked up to Samuel slowly, her heart still racing. She had watched him stand his ground against an officer who had tried to tear him down with nothing more than his prejudice. And she had seen how calmly Samuel had handled it, how strategically he had used his words to diffuse the tension without giving into anger or violence. "You were amazing," Olivia whispered, her voice filled with admiration. "I don't think anyone's ever stood up to him like that. Not in this town." Samuel turned to face her, his expression unreadable for a moment. "It's not about me," he said quietly. "It's about everyone who's had to endure what I just did. It's about the system that continues to treat people like me as if we don't matter." Olivia nodded slowly, her throat tightening. She knew exactly what he meant. She had seen it, lived it in her own way, and now she understood how it felt to watch someone take a stand. "This is just the beginning," Samuel continued, his voice filled with quiet determination. "The system doesn't change overnight, but it does change. And every time someone stands up, every time we refuse to stay silent, it makes a difference, "But I need your help, Olivia. We need to fight back together." As he said the words, a new resolve filled her. She had been on the sidelines for too long. It was time to take action, to step into the fight. But the stakes were higher than ever. "Of course," she said, her voice steady. "Whatever it takes." Samuel offered her a small smile, before his attention turned back to the door. "It's not over yet, not by a long shot."